Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. Debunking Atheism, Volume 11. In this video, I want to address one specific question, and that is, what's the difference between God and the block universe? Now, this is a very important question. Many atheists will equate God with the block universe, claiming God as some sort of Spinozian universe, and that solves the problem. That a God that we know is not this personal agent or this God that continuously intervenes in human history, but rather God is essentially the universe itself. This is considered a heresy called pantheism, but nonetheless, many philosophers, if they entertain the idea that God is real, they'll couch it in terms of a pantheistic God, a Spinozian God, or a God that is essentially equated with Einstein's block universe. And for all intents and purposes, this sort of Spinozian God is not uh, the God of the Bible, not a personal God. This is this is really just a cover for atheism. So, what is the difference between God and the block universe? Well, the fundamental difference is creation. So, while God is timeless and changeless um, and immaterial, and you could describe the block universe very similarly. The block universe, time is an illusion, change is an illusion, movement is an illusion, and except for and actually the future, present, and past all simultaneously exist and are all real. So they're very similar. The concept of God and the block universe are very similar concepts, and it's easy to become confused between the two. And you could easily make the argument, well, what do you need God for? Because we have the block universe or a block physical reality. Wouldn't Occam's razor make God superfluous and an added assumption that you need not make, and therefore you can eliminate God and simply equate God with the block universe? So why do you need God? And the answer is because of creation. The block universe doesn't create anything. The block universe, or the universe that general relativity and special relativity um, posit, is this universe where the past, present, and future all exist equally, and that time is an illusion, and so is movement and change. It's a very mathematical reality. It's a reality whose existence is presumed based on the calculus of uh, of physics, of general relativity and special relativity. So it's really a mathematical reality, a mathematical universe. There's no need for creation in that sort of universe. Um, how is that different than God? Well, God can create. God can create physical reality. The block universe has no need of creation, doesn't create anything. It all exists. So the central question then is, why do you need creation? Is creation necessary for physical reality? And if it is, then God is necessary because God creates, and the block universe does not. So why do you need creation? Why is creation necessary? There are really two opposing views about the nature of physical reality. There is the view that physical reality is continuous, and the view that physical reality is discrete. There's a view of the infinitesimal and the view of the indivisible. The infinitesimal is a hypothetical mathematical unit of reality at which you can't get any smaller. It's a mathematical term. And then you have the indivisible, which means, again, it can't get any smaller, but it is a discrete unit. There's a view of the mathematical and the view of the physical, what actually happens in physical reality, as opposed to a mathematical, hypothetical model. And these views between the continuous and the discrete, this debate has been going on for thousands of years. It goes back to the atomists in classical Greek, and the debate is still going on to this very day. But generally speaking, you could say that the idea of the block universe is really the idea of continuity, the continuous, whereas the idea of occasionalism, the idea of creation, is this other view of discreteness or indivisibility or indivisible units. So, which is right? So, the block universe says that physical reality is a giant block of all things that ever happen at any time and at any place. Past, present, and future all exist and are equally real. Uh, the block universe says that time and change are illusions. So, to understand how you could think that time and change and movement are illusions, you have to think in mathematical terms. So, if you think of a graph, and let's say there's a curve on this graph, uh, the change in the curve is real. It's on the graph. It's part of this line. This line is continuous, meaning you can break it up into infinitely as many segments as you want. It's a mathematical object. So it's a continuous mathematical object that changes, and yet there's no time or physical reality and movement necessary for this thing to exist. So the idea of the block universe is essentially a mathematical conception of physical reality. And that's really no surprise since general special relativity uses mathematics as its model for describing physical reality. So what happens is the physicists jump to the conclusion that physical reality must be just like their graphs, must be mathematical, must be continuous. And that's a big assumption. That's an assumption. So the question is, are they right? Is that what physical reality truly is like? It's one thing to say, well, that's what the mathematics says, but mathematical models don't prove that physical reality is exactly what the mathematics says it is. It's an assumption. What's the opposing view? The opposing view is occasionalism. Occasionalism says that physical reality consists of discrete, indivisible frames or units of space time that God creates, destroys, and then creates a new frame, destroys, and then creates another new frame, and that this sequence of creations, destructions, creations is what we experience as physical reality, time, change, movement. The present moment is this creation of this particular frame of physical reality by God. In occasionalism, the past and the future are not as equally real as the present moment. Only the present moment is real. So occasionalism is a form of presentism. And in occasionalism, the view is that God is necessary to create physical reality in order to create this occasionalistic um, view of physical reality. So, why is creation necessary? We all experience time, change, movement. We know these are real things. Um, you can look at time as a movie film where there's a number of frames. And as the frames go by, uh, each frame is a discrete unit of space time. And as each frame goes by, things move, change, just like you're watching a movie. And that's what creates time and change and movement. So time is like a movie film. There are frames, and those frames are similar to one another, but not exactly the same. And that similarity is what creates the sense of time and movement and change. So, what would happen under occasionalism to this movie film um, versus what would happen to it under the block universe theory? So, under occasionalism, you would have separate frames. They would be discrete frames, indivisible, discrete units of space time, and there would be no time between each frame. However, there would be a finite number of frames between any 2 points in time. Under the block universe, um, there would be no time between frames because time doesn't exist in the block universe. It's an illusion. So everything's continuous. So in a block universe, you could say there would be frames, but there would be no time in between frames. Or, in other words, there wouldn't be a separation between frames. So what does that mean? That means there would be an infinite number of frames between two moments in time. Under the block universe and a continuous understanding of the nature of physical reality, you can continue to subdivide these frames for infinity. So there would be an infinite number of frames, a continuous infinite number of frames. Well, what happens when you run this movie film under these two theories? Well, under occasionalism, you get time. You get what we experience as time and change and movement, because there's a finite number of frames. As you go through the frames, things change. True, there is no time between the frames, and I'll solve that problem in a second for you. But under the block universe, if there's an infinite number of frames, um, to get from point A to point B in time, you're constantly looking at your watch forever because you can't get through an infinite number of frames. Nothing moves. There's an infinite number of the same frame uh, till you get to the next frame. So what that means is movement is not possible. Change is not possible. So while the block universe people say that, well, time is an illusion, the truth is that their explanation of a continuous physical reality does not permit movement at all. It's not that movement or time is an illusion. It's that your theory doesn't work at all, and you can't have movement or time because you can't get through and wait for an infinite number of the same exact frame till you get to the next frame. So movement is not possible. It's simply not possible. The block universe theory cannot explain movement, change, or time. They can call it an illusion, but they can't explain it. It's inexplicable. It's impossible. It's an impossibility. So the block universe idea of this continuous nature of physical reality is wrong. It's just flat out wrong. Um, Occasionalism is compatible with everything that has been shown to be experimentally true in relativity. Because if God creates, destroys, creates, destroys, creates, destroys, uh, each frame of space time, that means God can do anything he wants to all of physical reality through each frame, even mimicking the effects of relativity. And moreover, because it's occasionalism, you can't prove that it's false because there's nowhere to go to prove whether these finite frames exist or not, or that they're really happening, because they don't happen in a greater reality with its own time and space from which you can observe the movement of these frames. So, because there's no time between the frames, so you can't verify whether, scientifically, whether the occasionalism is true or not. But uh, it definitely allows for the present experience of time. So that's reason to believe it's true. Whereas the block universe does not. There's no way that you can take an infinite number of frames that are exactly the same thing and expect to be able to experience movement or change or time. It makes no sense at all. So occasionalism is the one that makes it make sense. Now, why is God necessary for occasionalism? The reason is because there's no time between each frame. What that means is that because there's no time between each frame. There's essentially nothing between each frame, or nothingness. But the next frame cannot be caused by nothingness, because nothingness can't cause something. You can't get something from nothing. You can't get the next frame from nothing. So you need a God to be able to create the next frame. You need a God to be able to remember what the previous frame was and create the next frame, so that it's only slightly different than the first frame, in order to give a sense of continuity, which will allow you to experience time, change, and movement. So God is necessary uh, in occasionalism, and more importantly, creation is necessary. Something has to create this next frame. Nothing can't create anything. So God is necessary in occasionalism to create the next frame of space, time, and physical reality. Whereas in the block universe, if you had an infinite number of frames, there would be nothing between the frames. So there would be no need for creation of the next frame. But as I explained, you can't traverse an infinite number of frames where the frame is exactly the same thing. The frames would have to change to some degree, but since it's infinite, uh, you'd have to pick an arbitrary number of frames to get to the next frame where there's some change. But since it's infinite and continuous, you can't pick an arbitrary number, so it's got to be infinite, which means you have an infinite number of the same exact frame, which means time can't move. You can't move. You can't have movement and change uh, under the block universe as far as physical reality goes. So this is an impossible theory of time and change and movement. It's wrong. And occasionalism can explain the phenomenon of relativity just as well as the block universe can, except that occasionalism makes sense in terms of movement. So, so while God and the block universe are similar, creation, however, we know must be real, because we know physical reality is real, because we know movement occurs. And because of that, we know creation must be real. And because creation must be real, then there must be a creator, which means God must be real. And God has this ability to create physical reality. And that's the primary difference between God and the block universe. God can create physical reality, and the block universe cannot. Um, and physical reality and the movement of physical reality necessitates creation. So it necessitates a God. So the block universe simply does not explain physical reality, doesn't explain movement or time or change. And those things would be impossible, even under its own premise of an infinite number of frames. Even with an infinite number of frames, movement is still not possible. It doesn't make logical sense. Um, the block universe makes mathematical sense because mathematics has infinities in it. So if you take a number line, say between 0 and 1, yes, there are indeed an infinite number of points on this line, which we call infinitesimals. But that's a mathematical concept. We're talking about physical reality, not mathematics. And this is where a lot of atheists get confused. A lot of Spinozian atheists, pantheists, even physicists. It's because they equate the mathematical model of general and special relativity with physical reality. They assume wrongly that they are the same exact thing, and they're not. And you know what they say about assuming? It makes an ass out of you and me. And that's what these Spinozian, atheistic, relativistic physics, agnostic types are doing. They're making an assumption that mathematics represents physical reality. Wrong. It can't. I just explained to you why it can't. Instead, you need creation. That means you need a God with the ability to create. Sure, God understands this mathematics. God is unchanging. That's true. And timeless. And God doesn't move, just like the block universe. But the big difference is God can create. Math can't create. A number line can't create anything. God can create. And that's the central difference. And that's why God is necessary for physical reality, for time and change to exist. This idea of occasionalism is also used in one of the cosmological arguments, the argument from time. So you can watch the video on that or read that argument to give you a little more idea of how important the idea of occasionalism is to proving the existence of God. One other point, even though God has the power to create physical reality, God does not have to use that power to create physical reality. So creation itself is not absolutely necessary. God can be real without creating a single thing. But God still has that power to create. So creation itself is not necessary for reality, for God's reality to be real. But God has that power. And another thing about the block universe and these frames. The block universe is continuous, which means it must have an infinite number of frames between point A in time and point B in time. And it has to be that way continuous, because if there was nothing between the frames, then you'd have a situation where nothing would be creating the next frame, which would be an impossibility. Oh, because you can't get something from nothing. So without God to create that next frame, in the idea of a block universe, this continuity, you have to have continuity. You have to. You can't have indivisible frames. So what that means is that the block universe is absolutely stuck with this idea of an infinite number of frames between point A and point B in time, and the fact that there would be an infinite number of frames which are identical, which don't change at all. And that means there can't be movement or change or time. So the whole theory of the block universe in terms of continuity is completely flawed. It doesn't work in physical reality. It works in mathematics, but it doesn't work in physical reality. Assumption, wrong assumption. This mathematical continuity does not work in physical reality. It does not work to create movement necessary in physical reality. You need a God for that. All right. Uh, I hope you learned something, and take care.